of all, Roy, let's start off by you telling us how it was your family found their way to the Philippines.
Well, in 1922, after getting back from fighting in the First World War for the French Foreign Legion, my father joined an oil company because it was pretty boring in the United States, and he bought a Harley Davidson and came over to China, and he rode his Harley Davidson into the interior of China all alone selling oil. So after that, he met my mother in Chicago in 1929. They got married, and they came back to China, and in a little while he was promoted to the main office in Manila, Philippines, where I was born in 1936.
And what other siblings do you have?
I have no other siblings. I'm an only child.
Okay. So how old were you at the outbreak of war then?
I was 5 years old at the outbreak of war and 8 years old when I was liberated.
Okay. Many people when we realized, or when the United States realized that we were probably going to end up in a war with Japan, many of the people that were living in the Philippines were going to the High Commissioner's office and talking to Francis Sayers, who was the High Commissioner at that time, asking whether or not they felt it was time to send their families back home, particularly in lieu of the fact that the military dependents had been sent home in July of that year. Do you recall ever any conversations your parents having with regard to that?
Well, it was a constant conversation, and it was a lifelong anger that my father felt for the State Department for leaving us there in the way of great harm, and he never did forgive the State Department for that.
Do you know if he actually went to the High Commissioner's office?
Oh yes, I know he went to the High Commissioner's office and asked, and he was told, not a problem, don't worry about it, we're going to be able to defend the Philippines. But shortly before the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, he also went to a meeting with all the high officials, including the top military brass, and every single person who spoke at that meeting said that the Japanese are going to attack and we're going to be overwhelmed. But it was too late to get out by that time.
Do you remember, you were a young 5-year-old boy, do you remember what your parents were doing at that time to kind of prepare for war?
Well, there wasn't much preparation at all. I mean, I don't think we did much to prepare for it, but once they started bombing, they bombed on the 9th, the day after Pearl Harbor, started bombing down the street, bombing every other house, and I was hiding under the steps. My father said it was the safest place, and when the bomb hit the garage right behind where we were, I jerked free and ran out the front door and looked across the street, and I saw a pinpoint of light, like a little tiny flashlight, only as bright as the sun. And I watched that, it was about 30 yards away. I watched that light grow bigger and bigger until it was bigger than the sun, and I realized there was a bomb going off right in front of me. So I turned around and ran back into the house, and shrapnel just missed my leg and hit the steps, stone steps, and put little stone chips across my legs. I ran around the corner, and my father had his head in his hands because he figured he had lost me, and once told a friend later that he suddenly realized he was no longer just an adventurer, that he did have a family and was responsible for his mother, for my mother and myself. In fact, he often told me in the camp he would have escaped and joined the guerrillas if it hadn't have been for me. So I take credit for having saved his life.
I'm trying to imagine what it must have been like for you, being 5 years old, and seeing war break out before my very eyes. Can you give us an inkling of what that must have been like for someone that young?
Well, I'll tell you a strange event. This was a strange event because I was used to being isolated all alone as an only child in a house with a lot of servants and an ama, and who watched over me all my waking hours, and suddenly thrown into camp where I lost my ama, and But what was there were hundreds of children about my age who I had not been able to interact with because of our isolation of our lifestyle. And I started running around and playing with all these people. And at the beginning, it was just wonderful. I just was really enjoying it. But then things developed for the worse.
Tell us about the package line. You had indicated to us a few minutes ago that your parents were receiving help from friends and I'm guessing maybe servants from the outside. What do you remember receiving from the package line?
Well, at least for the first 6 months, we received all our food from the package line, and it was great food. In retrospect, it was a wonderful situation, and we didn't see starvation as any possibility under that system. Unfortunately, the package line was closed after a while, and then less and less came in. But eventually, we had to just rely on the food that the camp was providing, and then it started to get really difficult, and we started to head into starvation in the last year in a big way. My mother went from 165 pounds, 5'6", a little bit plump, to 98 pounds when we were liberated. And I went from 50 pounds age 5 to 50 pounds age 8, eating exactly the same rations as my parents. And my father went from 115 pounds, 145 pounds, trim, 5'10", to 115 pounds, and then he started getting beriberi, which is where the water leaks into your pores and you start to look fat, and even though you're starving to death. So he was very close, I think, to death when we were liberated.
Let me just look at your notes here for a second. A moment ago we were talking about when things started getting really bleak as far as lack of food and the fact that your father had severe beriberi and was really getting close to dying. I know you've told a magnificent story about a diamond ring. Can you share that with us?
Well, yes, this happened on February 2nd, 1945. I walked into my shanty and I saw a Japanese soldier, and I noticed he was not an officer, he was a soldier, talking to my parents. I'd never seen anything like that. I never heard anything like that. I understood that the Japanese would execute any soldier that interacted with the internees. And my mother and father had struck a deal where a beautiful blue-white diamond that cost my father $1,000 in 1929, several carats with sapphires on each side, that we would trade that diamond ring for 2 kilos of rice, or 4.4 pounds of rice, payment upon delivery of the rice. So we were to get delivery on February 4th, 1945. Fortunately, the Americans came in and liberated us in camp on February 3rd, and so that ring was available to us. And our middle son, very handsome, 6 feet 4 inches tall, who I brought to the Philippines in 1995 for the 50th reunion, he went back to the United States, fell in love with and married a half Filipino girl, and she chose that ring for the engagement ring, and it sits on her hands now as the engagement ring of our only daughter-in-law.
The significance of that ring is amazing. Tell me how that felt to see that on her hand.
Well, as I tell the story, I tend to break into tears, and I understand the story was told to her by my son Daniel, and she broke into tears. So it's got a very special meaning. I know this because every one of our 3 other children said they were hoping to get the ring. This is the first I heard of that. I figured it's first come, first serve. They may never get married.
That's a great story. I love that story. Okay. What other camp stories can you think of that really stand out in your mind?
Well, I was known in camp as TNT Doolan. I was a boxer, and several thousand of the camp would come out to these entertainment events, and one of their favorite was to rig up a ring and put a great big boxing gloves on little tiny kids and have them slug it out, 3 rounds, 1-minute rounds. And I won my age group after winning like 3 straight fights, and was feeling really good about that. And they put me up in an older age group, fighting kids 6 months older than myself, and I proceeded to lose 3 straight fights. This bothered me a great deal. In the last one, I said, this is not fair. I'm a lot tougher than that guy. So I beat him up on the way home from school, just to prove my point. My father was my trainer, and he told me to conserve my energy. So after losing the first 2 rounds, it was very hard to make a comeback in the 3rd round, having granted 2 of the 3 rounds. But even a few years ago at a reunion, somebody saw my name. Mike Doolan, I was called then, and said, "Oh, you're TNT Doolan." So I had a name in camp.
When do you remember first feeling hungry, really hungry?
Well, I don't remember a specific time, but I just remember that when the 3rd year got going, then we started worrying. And the kids, we could tell that things were not going well, and my father told me the story of coming home and seeing kids sitting around in a circle making funny faces and trying to make each other laugh, which is an old a joke among kids. But he asked why they were doing that, and the kids all said, well, we're conserving our energy. You never hear that from kids who have a full stomach.
Do you remember Christmas of 1944?
Well, yeah, a little bit. We had to, you know, celebrate Christmas in some way, and at first, in the first couple of Christmases, we had little gifts that we got because there was a black market going on in camp, and there was a little bit of money that you could buy things. And it's my recollection that the last Christmas we got a box and a couple boxes, and we wrapped them up and with very pretty Christmas paper, and then when we opened it up there wasn't anything in the boxes. The whole idea of it was to open a present with but there was nothing in it. We used to like to have a drink before dinner. That was something that my father and mother just couldn't give up. They had to have a drink before dinner. But alcohol was extremely expensive and pretty much impossible to get. And so my father managed to buy a few cloves of garlic now and then, and we would take a glass and he would rub the garlic around the glass, and he'd pour water into it, giving it a garlic flavor. And so we would, this garlic flavored glass was a Coca-Cola for me, and a Scotch and soda for my father, and a Canadian Club and ginger ale for my mother.
Great stories. These are good. These are really good.
Okay.
Pause.
Yeah.
3 other incidents of it, and I just remembered that one.
Okay.
Okay, go ahead.
Go ahead and tell that story then.
Well, one day in October, I was playing with my friends, and the loudspeaker sounded, and that was our contact in the camp between the people. And of course, the at the other end of the loudspeaker was an American from the camp with an interpreter next to the American to make sure that nothing was said that was against Japanese policy. So we had been waiting for a rice shipment from Japan, and considering we were starving to death, this was very important to us. So the announcer announced as follows. The announcer said that the ship has arrived in Manila Harbor, but it's better late than ever. And we realized the rumors of the Americans landing on Leyte were true. And it just gave the whole camp just this big lift. Of course, in that month, in October, we had another little hint of it, which was one day we looked up at the sky, and you could see a plane and another plane and another plane, and there were literally hundreds of planes. There were probably 300 planes coming over the camp. And the Japanese had warned us that we were not to watch the planes, but we did it anyway. And it was fascinating to watch the planes riding over Manila with puffs of smoke on all sides. And the plane would be going through these puffs of smoke, and the smoke was anti-aircraft shells exploding around the planes. And once in a while, a plane would be hit. And occasionally it would head back in the opposite direction, trailing a smoke. But if it got hit, chances are it would start to lose altitude and then crash down into the ground. But overall, our feeling was of such joy to see that there was tangible proof, not a rumor, which abounded in the camp, but real tangible proof that the Americans were indeed coming.
I'm curious to know, do you remember noticing a difference in the way the airplanes sounded, U.S. versus Japanese?
Well, I would say no, and that's because of this. The Japanese, even at the very best of times, only had a few planes. I mean, very rarely we would see a Japanese plane go over the camp. They were using the planes in other parts of the Pacific, and you'd seldom see them. And we would derogatorily say, there goes the sign of the flying fried egg, concerning their flag. But those planes were amazing in one respect. My father explained to me that they didn't bother with armor because, well, it was just a Japanese pilot and they didn't care too much about the life or death of the pilots. And so they took off the armor. Well, if you take any plane and you take off the armor and it's pretty well engineered, it's going to do pretty well against other planes that are in the sky. And they, in the beginning of the war, did mighty well against the American planes. Toward the end of the war, the U.S. got P-38s, and those things were just better planes. At the very end of the war, right after the war, I read that the United States produced, in the last year, 10,000 military airplanes. And you know, there is the explanation of how we happened to beat Japan, because by the last year we ruled the air, we ruled the sea, and the Japanese could not do anything about us coming closer and closer to their islands. We simply outproduced them.
I'd like to talk a little bit about liberation. Tell me your recollection of liberation.
Well, I was playing in a ways from the main building, and some other kid ran up to me and said, "There's a Filipino shouting over the fence." And I thought that was strange because I'd been there 3 years and 1 month and I didn't remember anybody ever shouting over the fence, and for good reason. The Japanese would have shot anyone that they saw speaking to us over the fence. And I came and the Filipino was talking very fast, and I couldn't understand it, partly because I just couldn't believe it. He kept saying over and over again, "The Americans are coming, the Americans are coming." He must have said it 4 times before I could grasp what he was saying, but I still didn't believe it. And then he said, "If you listen, you can hear the gunfire." And so I listened, and sure enough, there was gunfire coming from about a mile away, small arms fire. So I said, "This has got to be true." So I ran back to tell my parents. My father, being a really experienced adventurer and swashbuckling person, said, "Okay, now we stay in our shanty, so we don't going to go out there and get in their way." And so we stayed there until other people came by a little later and said, "You know, they have come into camp, and they're right behind the main building there in the tanks." So I took off to reconnoiter. By that time, my father couldn't walk, and my mother stayed with him. And we went out there and looked at. I looked at the tank commander, who was halfway in and halfway out of the tank, and was just marveled at him. He was a Texan. In fact, one of my close friends, a 6-year-old girl, came back to her parents and said, "The Americans have come and they are fat." Well, there weren't any fat soldiers, but they were fat compared with us. And so I stood there watching and marveling over them, and finally I heard the tank commander say, "You know, you have to go back to where you live because we have a war to fight here, and there are quite a few guards still in the camp, and we haven't done anything about them, and we need to get out there and clean up that situation. So you just go back to your shanties or wherever you're staying." So quite obediently, I went back to my shanty, and we celebrated. We were allowed 2 meals a day, and we could take 1 meal by getting a rice ration for the week and cook it, our breakfast. And so we had just gotten our rice ration for the week, and my father said, "Well, let's cook it up, the whole thing." So they cooked it up, and we ate 1 week's rice ration right there. And then a friend of mine came over and said, "Well, you missed all the fun out there because that tank was getting ready to take off, and the Japanese commandant came out, shaking his hands around, telling the Americans they can't get away with this. And the American in the tank said, 'Put your hands up,' in Japanese. And he didn't do it. In fact, he put his hand down into a place where there was actually a grenade. And the American opened up with a Tommy gun and basically cut him in half with the Tommy gun. A Japanese aide was with him, and they took the 2 of them and put them in a cell. It was just a room that was designated for it in the main building. And the whole camp was just thrilled with the commandant being thrown in his body, thrown into a cell with one of the aides. And I have to say that at that time there was tremendous hatred for the Japanese. I would say Jap, and it was a huge, overwhelming hatred of them, and it was something you can't know unless you go through it yourself. It's a hatred which I find some of my friends who were in the camp with me carry to this day. But for me, it's a hatred that was gone well by the time I started college. I've had none of that. And in fact, the best man in our wedding 41 years ago he is still alive. He's half Japanese and half German. He had a little bit of problem in World War II in the United States, but that's another story.
Tell us why it was so important that the Americans liberated the internment camp at Santo Tomas when they did.
Well, we had a feeling of doom coming, and this was exacerbated by the fact that the camp authorities were going around asking who were the males between age 16 and about 55, I think. The Japanese insisted upon that. They wanted this list. And of course we suspected it was to take them to the front lines and use them as hostages, which I believe it was. And so after days and days, the Japanese said, "Where is this list?" Well, the authorities had the list. They just weren't giving it to the Japanese. And so the authorities presented it in this manner. They said, in the main building there are 124 males in that category. In the annex there's 185. And the Japanese said, we didn't want to ask how many there were in each of these places. We wanted their names. And he ranted and raved for hours. And our camp authorities said, well, we just didn't understand. It was just a mistake. And then the message went out to continue to interview, but never turn anything in on it. So this was kind of tipped off the camp that something was happening. Later, reading all about it, I have read that there was a message from Japan, the headquarters in Japan, saying that no prisoners of war should ever be turned over to the Americans, and they are to be killed before they're turned over. And in the southern Philippines, there was a military camp where the men were put in ditches and gasoline poured on them and set up a fire, and they tried to kill them all. And even during camp, there was a rumor that they had mined the main building, which I wouldn't be surprised at. So, well, the kids had a feeling it was very dangerous, but I think that the parents, they knew it was a very dangerous situation, so it was very tense in camp.
You were just telling us a minute ago you had a story about a very young soldier. Maybe you could share that with us.
Well, this is a story about what happened after the Americans came in the camp. The children were ecstatic about it. They rushed to the soldiers. They ended up getting K rations, frequently chocolate, and it was great. But then they got sick, and that wasn't so great, and that got stopped. But there was a kid who didn't come back from dinner, and his parents were very worried about him, and he didn't show up, and he didn't show up. And finally he showed up at 10 o'clock, and they said, "Where were you?" And he said, "Well, it was great." He said, in the late afternoon, one of the soldiers asked me if I wanted to go in the tank that he was running and have a look at it. So I climbed in and looked all around the tank, and that was great. And then he said, "Well, we have an assignment to go out and clear the area of Japanese. Would you like to come along?" And I said yes. And so I joined the tank, and we went out. We rode all around this area of Santo Tomas. And it was a lot of fun, but then we came to a corner, and there was a Japanese tank on the other corner of this intersection, and the two tanks opened up fire on each other. Well, the story the little boy told is that he got in the tank at the invitation of the soldier and looked at the tank, and then the soldier said would he like to go on a mission with him, and he said he'd love to. And so he was in the tank, and the tank went out and rode all around the camp area. It was MacArthur's position to always be on the offense. So this happened right after the camp was taken, that the tanks would go out and look for trouble. And the boy said that things were pretty smooth until they came to an intersection, and lo and behold, there was a Japanese tank at the intersection. And so the American tank and the Japanese tank opened up fire on each other, and the little boy said, but we hit them, they didn't hit us. And so we destroyed the Japanese tank, and we came back here, and he said, It was great fun. Mom and Dad, that was great. And naturally, I was just so jealous of it.
And you were his same age? You were
Yes,
his
he
age.
was about 10, and I was 8.
It's a good, great story. Then you were telling us another story just a few minutes ago. Why don't you go ahead and tell us that one as well?
What do you...
About not being able to get in school?
Yeah.
Oh, well, I came back to the United States and went to Chicago, where my parents were both from, and went to school, and the principal came out and said to my father that it must be a terrible burden to have a son like yours. He said, I can't imagine anything more upsetting than a situation like that, like this. And my father said, what is it? And he said, well, he's just scored the lowest on an IQ test in the history of our school, and it's 50 years old. He said he scored a 35, and a 30 is the IQ of a chimpanzee. So he said, I'm sorry, but we'll not be able to teach him anything except maybe possibly tie his shoes. He's just not educatable. So my father said, well, did you ask him about frogs? And he said, no, there's nothing on the test on frogs. And he said, well, did you ask about kerosene lanterns? And he said, no, there's nothing there. Well, he says, my son could take a kerosene lantern apart, oil it, and put it back together again. He said, I'm not really worried about him. I don't believe that. Could it possibly be that this test is influenced by the fact that he spent 3 years in a Japanese prison camp where he didn't experience any of these things you're talking about? And the principal said, no, this is an international test. It's good no matter what the culture or whatever your background. That's the way it is. Well, I remember 2 questions on the test. One of them was a train conductor. Well, the person was dressed up in a typical striped kind of train conductor outfit, which you recognize from books, but I didn't read any books, so I didn't recognize that. Another was a very simple one, which I think most everybody knows. It was a plug and a socket. But we didn't have any in camp, and I didn't recognize a plug and a socket. So I was kind of upset by that. I mean, anyway, my father said, don't worry, just you'll do fine, put him in school. And my mother said, well, be sure to put him in the row next to the window, because I understand that's the row where your best students are. And on every paper, write 100, because he gets discouraged easily. And so that's what they did. And I had an aunt who was a school teacher, tutor me, came back to the Philippines for 2 years, went back to the United States, and by that time we were talking about the possibility of skipping me ahead of my normal grade. So in 3 years I went from knowing nothing about spelling, reading, math to where I could easily jump ahead a grade. And since then I have an undergraduate degree, MBA from Cornell University, a law degree from the University of California, Berkeley, an advanced law degree in taxation, an LLM in taxation, and a CPA certificate.
Just for the record, what vocation did you end up in?
I was a tax attorney for the Internal Revenue Service for 30 years, and then I went to my favorite attorney on the other side, who I respected and had a lot of business, and worked for him for 6 years representing taxpayers against the IRS. And I found 30 years with the IRS was a good background for challenging the IRS.
That's great. Can you reiterate for us the story you were talking about when you went to a classroom and the comment that the little boy made to you?
Well, I came back to, in 1948, I returned to the United States, where my father retired early at age 52. And in Healdsburg, just a small little town in Northern California, I was telling a little boy of my age about my time in camp, just briefly mentioning that I was in the camp, and the kid wanted to say something really nice to me because he was trying to be my friend, and so he said, "Well, it's amazing, Roy, that you're not more screwed up than you obviously are." And I have I remembered that my whole life.
When you think back on the experience of camp life, and you think about your parents and what they must have been going through raising a young boy at that time, what kind of impressions do you have of what they experienced?
Well, camp was a very different experience than the everyday life in the United States. It was like a village, and it was a village bringing up the kid. And believe it or not, their responsibilities in the camp were minimal, because we were out there playing with the other kids, and we were interacting with a lot of the adults, and I don't think they worried about whether we would get into trouble as you can so easily when you have more independence. It was. I don't think it was that hard on them.
Maybe perhaps once food became a real problem, I'm guessing then they were pretty concerned. They would be able
Well,
to
they were concerned. You know, everyone was concerned for everyone else. I mean, we were all in the same boat. When we first went into the camp, the first commandant told us, "You had better hope that Japan wins this war with the United States, because if Japan starts to lose this war against the United States, your life is going to get worse and worse and worse." And we thought he was a mean commandant when we were in camp at the beginning. He was transferred, and just what he said transpired. And we ended up looking back on him as the most wonderful commandant we'd ever had.
You want to shut down first? You were mentioning earlier that even though there are many former internees that have enormous hatred toward the Japanese, that you somehow have been able to transcend that. Do you know how that happened?
Well, I have given it the necessary thought, and I never really solved it, except to know that my parents always felt you should respect every human being, and although they were out here in really colonialist times, they had tremendous respect and friendship with the Filipinos, and somehow they transmitted to me a feeling that racial prejudice and intolerance was a very, very bad thing, and I just didn't have it. And I know when it was time to go to college, I had a lot of views that did not fit very well with U.S. society. I believed in equal rights for women. I believed in equal rights for minorities. I believed that religion could be both good and bad depending on the situation, and that it was not appropriate to blame this or that on religion or God. And I had these strange ideas for a small farm town. And I ended up going to Reed College in Portland, Oregon, and found myself surrounded by intellectuals that had similar beliefs. And I thought, oh, I'm home, and it was a wonderful feeling to find there's other people similarly view.
I'm wondering what it means to you to be on a. We are right now interviewing you when you were in the middle of a trip of other former internees who are coming back to be in touch with their past life, and I'm wanting to know from you how that feels.
Well, I'm 68 years old now, and I'm constantly in a state of amazement that I have lived this long. I was very worried when we had these nuclear standoffs with Russia, and I've just always been waiting for another war to break out or something you know, horrific to happen, because I don't see things as stable, and that what we have now we will always have. I realize how tenuous, you know, life is, and so I come here and just marvel at all the things that have happened here, and especially that so many people have reached out to us. I mean, the State Department had us over there at to see the embassy, or Santo Tomas held a wonderful commemoration with a huge orchestra and just a tremendous choral group, and top people were there. We've just been treated so well, and it's just it's really gratifying. I particularly love the fact that this has been an opportunity for my wife to share in it, because for 30 years I didn't want to get involved in any reunion type activities or anything like this. I put it behind me, and I wasn't going to do it, and my wife kept encouraging me to do this, have me speaking in places, and she just kept encouraging, and now she's come along, and she's had a chance to see this close up, and I wouldn't have done any of this without her.
Many people talk about being repatriated back to the United States, and of course you had never lived there, and I'm curious to know what the ship was like going home for you.
We had a lot of soldiers, because this was a troop ship headed back to San Francisco, and I would run around with my friends and look at all that water out there, and worry about the fact that if I fell off the ship, they promised us not to stop, but just to leave us behind, because that's an old trick for submarines to use, where they have someone on the ship and then that someone falls overboard, and then the ship stops, and it is an easy target for the submarines. I didn't know it at the time, but Tokyo Rose had broadcast many times while we were going across the Pacific that we would be sunk and killed, you know, stopping our liberation. And I was, well, with all the drills, we had constant drills where we'd come up on deck, and air raid sounds, and we were part of a big convoy, and we were kind of worried that we might be attacked.
Tell me about the Golden Gate Bridge.
Well, we came in on a foggy situation, which is not unusual for San Francisco area, and we were out a ways, and gradually we saw the outline of the bridge in front of us, and there was a big cheer that went up when we saw the bridge. And then we got closer and closer, and then we got right under the bridge, and we felt like this was a dividing point between being abroad and being back into the womb of the United States. And we came under that bridge, and just this huge applause broke out, and it was just this grand feeling of returning to freedom.
Talk about freedom. What is freedom?
Well, freedom is definitely being able to go outside of a 1 mile by 1 mile area crowded by 3,000 people, and it was to see so many marvelous things. When we got back into San Francisco, my father and mother contacted the company, and the company offered $1,000 to them for shopping over the weekend to get clothes. And our father said, we only need 500, and so my mother took 250 and my father 250, and we went out shopping. And it was weird or strange. I've never seen anything like it. All these streets and cars and walking crazy across some of the intersections and the lights, and you know, everything was just completely new to me. And my mother would ask for something, and they would say, we don't have that. We haven't had that since the war began. Don't you know there's a war on? And my mother would explode and explain how she knew there was a war on better than they knew there was a war on. We got back together, and my father said, well, I should have asked for more money because I got 85 cents. And my mother said, well, I think we should have, because I have 45 cents. And this is a Saturday, and we can't get in touch with the office until Monday. And so I said, well, I was shining shoes on the way across on the boat, and I've earned $7.80 shining shoes. So we've got almost, you know, $8.50 or $9. Why don't we eat in the coffee shop there at the St. Francis Hotel, a really top hotel then? And believe it or not, yeah, we all had a hamburger. So we had enough to eat for dinner on something like $9. And you know, that was 1945. And it just gives you a little idea of what's happened in inflation.
I would like for you to address the IOU situations and some of the finances that went on in camp. You had mentioned to us earlier that when your father returned to the United States, that his company had paid him all of his back wages. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about what you had explained before.
Yes. Well, my father had been in the Philippines quite a while, and he had friends who were Filipinos, some of them wealthy Filipinos. He had servants who were very much devoted to us, and they were willing to go out on a limb and bring us food while we were in camp. And we wanted to give them IOUs for the whatever the going rate was for the food and things that were being given us. One of the things that was we purchased was lumber really early in the first year. And my father, who was a carpenter, I didn't know that, but his father was a carpenter, he built a shanty in Shantytown. And it was like Millionaire's Row then. You know, it was about 12 feet by 12 feet, but I mean, to be taken out of those horrible dormitories with all the coffin and hundreds of people in a big room, it was wonderful. Anyway, we continued to get food all through the first couple of years, and each time the prices would go up, and you know, sometimes it was astronomical for the food costs. And so when he got back, when my father got his 3 years back salary, which was $10,000 for 3 years, he divided it up among his IOUs and paid it all over to Filipino people for providing sustenance during the war. Now, we thought it was wonderful that they provided it. And not for a moment did we feel that we were gouged by those high prices, because those were dangerous times. And there were times when the Philippine people were needy. They needed it. I mean, it was a very big deal that they did this to us, and we were very grateful for it.
You want to hold the camera for a second?
Okay.
Ready?
Yeah.
Well, when we first came into camp, my mother found a site in the annex. And she had several mosquito nets, but no mattress. We couldn't very well carry a mattress into camp, and she found a woman who had a mattress and no mosquito nets. So they got together, and we had a mattress, and used our mosquito nets, and the three of us, the woman and my mother and myself, slept on this big kind of double bed arrangement. We were allowed 38 square feet per person, and it's not very much. So it's extremely crowded, and it was a great big room in the annex, very, very large room, and just sleeping right next to each other. And I remember waking up often during the night, which for a child is very unusual. I mean, it never happened to me before or since, but I kept waking up because there were people coughing and whimpering and rolling over, and it was a racket there. And also, we had no air conditioning and really no fan going there, which is hotter than all get out, even into the night. And quite often, I would get up and go out and talk to the parents for a little while, because I was supposed to go to bed early. And I remember once going out and saying to them that my arm didn't bend right. It wasn't quite symmetrical, and I really believed there was something wrong with the way my arm was made. I just had never noticed that it's not exactly symmetrical as you expect it. And they said, "Oh, don't worry about that. Go back to bed." But I was so happy when we ended up with this wonderful shanty, even though you know, the shanty, you could see through it from all angles, and that was required because there wasn't to be any hanky-panky going on in the camp there. And but that didn't bother me.
Can you describe that shanty a little bit more in more detail?
Yes, well, the shanty was maybe, as I say, about maybe 12 feet, maybe 10 feet by 12 feet, and it had no walls anywhere around it, but it had a banister, which was about 3 feet off the floor, so you didn't fall off into something. And then what was most uncharacteristic for other areas, growing along the side and up all the posts, were beautiful gardenias. The whole thing was covered with gardenias, and the smell was enormous. I mean, the gardenias are very pungent flower. And it wasn't until I got out of camp that I discovered that at the next shanty, my friend Elaine Solomon, later Graydon, was selling those flowers. And she's making all kinds of money, you know, just selling them to other internees. And I didn't even know there was that possibility. And bringing in all this extra money for her family, she was a clever little girl. She always wanted to get involved with us boys, but you know, she was just you know, just a pesky little girl. We wouldn't have anything to do with her. I did notice though she was awfully bright. Like when MacArthur came, I wanted to go shake MacArthur's hand. I was determined I was going to do it. Well, I was about 4 feet 8 inches taller. You know, I was tiny, and somehow she got up there, and there's some picture of her with MacArthur holding her hand. She really, and I came back in 1995 with her, and she ran a heck of a tour.
What other stories do you have that you think might be interesting for people to hear about?
You should cut it for a minute. Well, my father came into camp, and he and all other people in the camp, except mothers with small children and disabled people, had to put in 2 hours of work for the camp. And in the beginning, my father found a job wiping off tables after lunch and dinner. And in fact, the camp had a lot of fun over the type of jobs that these people who were put in camp had. The most famous one that we really got a kick out of was that the top banker, who was really the top of the scale in the business world, was given a job of sitting outside the bathrooms and counting off 3 pieces of toilet paper and giving it to each person who goes into the bathroom. And that was his job. So my father wiped off those tables for a while, and then he got a job as a camp carpenter. And he and a very good friend of his in the next cabin, they did carpentry work for the camp. I asked my father, why did you choose carpentry, or how did you learn this? And he said, well, my father was a carpenter. And here I was, never hearing this. I mean, I can't understand why I didn't find out that his father was a carpenter. He did that for a while, and then he decided to get political and run for office. So he ran for mayor of Shantytown. He was elected mayor of Shantytown. At the time, I thought, this is really great. My father's the mayor. This is great. But after the camp, he told me that the Japanese proclamation was that if anybody escaped from a certain jurisdiction, the mayor would be executed. So he somehow found a way to put himself in harm's way, even in the camp. Another thing he did was just volunteer to be part of what was the camp police force. And that was a police force that went around with clubs. We weren't allowed guns or anything like that, of course, and we went around with clubs around the camp to keep the Filipinos from coming in and stealing from the internees. Now, you can imagine, the Japanese didn't care if they came over the fence and stole from the internees. They might shoot the Filipino that was found there, but they didn't care that the internees would lose whatever they had of value. So the camp took care of it, and that was my father's job.
I'm curious to know why you think it's important that the story of the internees at Santo Tomas be told.
Well, it seems to me that neither the United States nor Japan has come to grips with what happened in World War II. The terrible treatment of prisoners of war here in the Philippines has not really been adequately told. There is some publicity that's gotten out on the Bataan Death March, and you can find that, but far less publicity has been given to what the writers call the Rape of Manila, when the admiral of the Japanese fleet ordered his sailors to go to shore and kill every man, woman, and child that they could see. And they went on a rampage through downtown Manila and killed anywhere from 80 to about 110,000 Filipinos. We were safely tucked in camp, being protected by soldiers at that time. But that is very little known, even among Filipinos, younger Filipinos, and we've been in a couple of plaques around the Philippines, and they always put it this way. They say, this is in honor of the 100,000 Filipino citizens who were killed during the liberation of Manila, making it sound like maybe it might have been U.S. bombs that killed them, and I'm sure there were some U.S. bombs that killed some of them, but most of them, 80% or so, died from Japanese atrocities. And that has not been told. Now, looking at Japan and how they've handled it, I've delivered a talk on my prison camp experiences in a high school class in which I had the first half an hour, and the other half was a Japanese woman, age 22, just graduated from university in Japan, and the teacher for the class. She was teaching the class, and I got through my presentation, and she walked up there. It was the most emotional thing you could imagine, tears streaming from her eyes. And she looked out at the class and she said, I never knew I am so ashamed. I am so ashamed. I am so angry with my government for failing to tell me about this. She said, I had a wonderful education. I went to the best schools, and I majored in history in Japan. And they never told me that they did such things in the war. She said, the only place where we look to the war is we commemorate the surrender. At the exact moment of surrender, everyone in Japan stops anything they're doing and spends 1 minute contemplating. And what we contemplate is the shame of having lost to the Americans in the war.